Chapter 1 is most likely going to be the shortest chapter in this book, only because I didn't feel like writing about the rest of that boring car ride. But also because my first unimportant half day at Greenfield High School deserved to be split to be in one full chapter, not split into two chapters. Anyhow, when I got out of the car and stepped foot onto the Greenfield High School front campus, it immediately gave back memories of 6th grade and my first day at a new school. Both schools looked almost identical. The high school was the only one that was different because of its size. But other than that, if the high school was the same size as the middle school, you wouldn't be able to tell a difference. Even with the keenest eye, you wouldn't be able to tell a darn difference. The atmosphere of the school at a glance was warm and bubbly. Everybody was talking and there wasn't a single soul that was in a bad mood. The moment I began to walk through the bigger crowds that were hanging around in front of the school, I was genuinely surprised at how nobody recognized me. Little did I know that was a blessing in disguise. I could feel a weird emotion emerging within me. All the cars revving by on the nearby street, honking and revving their engines, the students' loud chatter. It was all something put together in an amazing manner, and in a good way too. I wondered when the school gates would open, but as I was walking around the perimeter of the school in boredom, I noticed an open door entering a dome-shaped structure. Very few students were around this door, and the sign above the door read School Library. This was a perfect place for quietness and examination. I entered the library and was hit with a whiff of air, the type of scented air that you receive when you buy or borrow a new book. I was hit with a wave of relaxation as I began to slowly pace to the main desk of the library. "Anything you need?" the librarian asked, face glued into a book. I looked at her before speaking. "No, I was just checking out the place," I replied. The librarian gave me a warm smile. "Are you one of the new freshman students at Greenfield High School?" she asked. I nodded. "You better get going. I'm sure that the front gates are opening now," the librarian said. "They are?" I asked in a concerned manner. Yep, she softly replied. I began to walk swiftly out of the library, making sure to take in that amazing scent of air once more before leaving. This was when I realized that I'd forgotten to brush my teeth. I felt myself become hot for a moment at that realization, but there wasn't anything I could do about that. As I exited the library and turned to my right, I saw a ton of students pouring into the front gate. The librarian really was right, and I needed to go quick just to make sure I wasn't tardy/truant to any of my classes. I didn't have any clue how the school was mapped out, though. I didn't have a clue on what my schedule was either. Those were my next worries, and if I didn't get an answer to relieve my worries, my parents would get a call about my tardies and would scold me for not knowing my way through a new school. So I took my very first step onto Greenfield High School's famous main hall. I was greeted by the sight of multiple teachers and some tall, muscular dude that I surmised to be the principal, all chanting on the new students at the high school. "All new freshman students, please report to the assembly hall adjacent to A Hall," the principal loudly said. Where in the world was A Hall? I have yet to receive any directions or a map of the school. As I was pondering the thought of where A Hall could have been, I noticed that these hallways were extremely loud in comparison to my old school. I also noticed that the visible layout of the school was quite similar to Greenfield Middle School, but it looked to be that there were twice as many hallways and the size was 3 times as large as the middle school. Crazy stuff. I couldn't ponder about any of that stuff for much longer. I needed to find where the assembly hall was located. I began to walk down the main hallway, looking at every label that caught my eye. I briskly walked past custodial hall, gymnasium hall, assembly hall. Then I noticed the assembly hall. I saw a lot of people pouring into this hallway in comparison to the gymnasium hall or custodial hall, so this had to be the right one. I started speed walking down the hall, eventually ending up at a massive grand door. This marked the end of the hallway, so I followed the several students already pouring into the room guarded by the massive grand door. That was when I realized it. That hallway led to a massive auditorium, larger than the one at the fair. My mouth was hung open as I walked down the carpeted midway, separating the seats into several different wings. I took a seat on the furthest wing of seats from the carpeted midway in the stage, laying my backpack down on the seat next to mine. Nobody was going to sit where I was, so this was a perfect seat to think and contemplate. Never would I have thought that a school would have a 5-star auditorium. Greenfield Middle School never had anything close to this. Even though I had a warm welcome into this unknown place, I felt incredibly insecure about everything and everyone here. As I was sitting in that auditorium seat, I was shaking. I couldn't describe the feeling I felt. Insecurity and fear would be the closest I could get to describing my feelings. I was stuck in a large train of thought for the next 15 minutes before I was startled by the sound of the massive red curtains opening abruptly. I fixed my posture in my seat as I watched the curtains open up. Welcome, freshmen, to the 2019 to 2020 school year, a spokeswoman cheered in an ecstatic tone. Everybody in the auditorium cheered with excitement in response. For today's exclusive assembly for our new freshmen, we will be talking about your schedules, lockers, school layout, and your teachers, the spokeswoman continued. After the spokeswoman spoke, another person who looked to be the principal emerged from behind the stage, clenching a microphone in his left hand. This year will be filled with opportunities and excitements nobody in this room will ever forget, the principal smiled. About as sudden as the principal was emerging, a massive screen turned on with intense brightness. The screen was projecting a presentation dedicated to helping freshmen navigate their way across the school. The first slide of this presentation will be the layout of the school, the principal said. The large screen illuminated by a projector changed its projection immediately after the principal spoke. Emerging from the screen was a large layout of the school. This was a very confusing layout, only because I was in the far back of the auditorium and couldn't see the layout very well. I was zoned out while the principal was speaking, and while the principal and spokeswoman continued speaking, meaning I couldn't hear what they were saying. What they were saying turned out to be meaningless because what took me out of a zoned out phase was the sound of hooting. Silence, the principal's booming voice shouted. The auditorium went dead silent. After the principal's shout, the projector changed slides to a locker slide. I will call out the names of people one by one to come up and grab their locker key and location, the principal said as he stepped a bit closer to the edge of the stage. Silence persisted once more before the first names were called up on the stage. Calvin Jorn, Amy Walker, and Leo Torres. Please step up, the principal said in a loud and clear voice. How in the world was my name called up almost immediately? I was so surprised that it took me a second to step out of my seat and walk down the midway onto the stage. Weirdly enough, this auditorium heavily reminded me of the circus, and I loathed that. Leo Torres, the principal said, "Are you here? Please step up on the stage." I began running down the midway of the auditorium. I was running so fast that I tripped myself on the last step of the huge staircase. Everybody was laughing, and I hoped they experienced something like that soon. Anyhow, I got up on the stage right behind a girl who I presumed to be that Amy person he called up. "Oh, hey, Leo," she muttered under her breath. I didn't respond, only looked forward, staring the principal dead in the eye. Calvin was already heading up the midway and was nearly back in his seat. Amy was getting talked to for a few moments before she left and went to her seat. Now it was my turn to get talked to. "Leo Torres?" the principal asked, his face riddled with shock. "Yes, it's me," I calmly said. The principal stood in silence, only looking at me with a warm smile. "You saved the city?" he asked again. His voice trembling. His voice trembling. "I don't know if I really did," I replied. "Joshua did all the work." "Joshua Franklin?" the principal mumbled. "He did all the work? He shed his blood to help save the city," I trembled. "Where is he?" the principal asked, his smile fading away. I paused for a few moments before speaking. "Dead," I very quickly said. The principal paused before giving me an envelope and excusing me. He said no words to me after I spoke. While I was walking back to my seat, I began opening the tightly sealed envelope with ease. When I opened it, several papers fell out of the envelope and onto the floor. I picked them up before swiftly sitting down. My locker was located in C Hall and was named C17. I hoped that wasn't far from my classes, only because I feared being tardy to any one of my classes. In the meantime, several other students were called up on the stage to get their locker envelopes while everybody else waited in silence for this assembly to be over. To be honest, I was very surprised when I noticed that only 5 minutes had passed when nearly half the auditorium had already had all their locker envelopes. Maybe this was going to go by quickly. "The assembly is now finished. Please leave the auditorium and report to your locker," the principal enthusiastically said, catching me out of a daze. I got myself out of my seat, backpack strap in hand, and walked out of the auditorium with the many freshmen who were present at the assembly. I rushed out of the assembly hall and began to walk over to C Hall where my locker was located. The hallways were incredibly crowded, but I didn't have much trouble getting into C Hall and eventually finding my locker. Utilizing the combination listed on one of the many papers within the envelope, I I managed to unlock the padlock on my locker. My locker door swung open, nearly whacking me in the face. Right when I opened my locker door, a piece of paper landed on the ground right next to my feet. I picked it up in eagerness, and it turned out to be my class schedule. I slipped my schedule into my pocket before taking a brief glance at the clock across the hall from me. Knowing that I was never going to use my locker at Greenfield High School like I did back in middle school, I completely disregarded my locker combination and never looked back. The time read 7:43, meaning I had to run like a madman to get to my advisory class in time, which turned out to be exactly what I did. I bumped into so many people in the hallways, but I didn't care. I needed to head to room 9 as soon as possible. Ding! The bell had just rang the moment I stepped foot into my advisory class. Technically speaking, I wouldn't be tardy since my foot was within the class. That's the logic I follow anyway. Mrs. West may not follow that logic. "Sit down, you brown-haired kid," Mrs. West snapped at me from her desk, briskly walked over to an empty seat and sat down. Mrs. West's classroom was oddly empty. Maybe she was the type of teacher who really didn't care about decorating classrooms. Hello, freshman students," Mrs. West said. "Did you all enjoy the assembly?" The whole class nodded their heads except a few students, like myself. "That's good to hear," Mrs. West mumbled. "For today's assignment, we have a quick form for everybody to fill out that will only take a few moments." A form? What in the world? I don't remember ever filling out a form on the first day of school, but here we are. "Levi, may you pass out all the papers to everyone in this class?" Mrs. West kindly asked a student in the class. "Yes, ma'am," he replied in a very deep voice. Levi stood up and picked up a large pile of papers, then began to hand them out one by one. Since I was sitting close to the back of the class, it was going to be a hot moment before I got a paper. I looked at everybody in the classroom. Nobody I recognized from middle school. This was going to be a tough year. After Levi walked past my desk, handing me the paper, I immediately took a good look at it. The form had 3 questions. I wish I was joking about that, but sadly I'm not. I opened my backpack, grabbed a sharp pencil, and began to fill out the form. The only 3 questions on this form were, how was your summer? How has the past week been for you? And how has your morning been? I answered all of those questions falsely. Mrs. West doesn't need to know I was involved in a second citywide disaster, even though she and the whole school probably already knew about it. "All right, class, get up and put your papers on the desk if you're done," Mrs. West loudly said in the dead silent classroom. I got up and walked over to her desk. I gently left my paper on her desk before heading back to my desk. I glanced up at the clock suspended over the whiteboard. The time read 7:59. It was going to be a long class period, and I knew that from miles away. 8:25 hit, and everybody was rushing out of Mrs. West's boring advisory class in a heartbeat. To put it in simple terms, we did absolutely nothing important in that boring class. All I did was sit in silence. Others were talking quietly. I overheard my name being thrown back and forth between the 2 girls in front of me having a conversation, but I didn't hear what they were saying about me. I pulled out my schedule from my pocket and read what my second period class was. English, located in room 31 in F Hall. I hated English, so I hoped this class wouldn't be a disappointment like advisory. I began my trek from B Hall to F Hall. That's when I realized how large the school was compared to what I was used to. When the time read 8:29 on the nearby clock and I just entered F Hall, I panicked. I sprinted down the nearly empty hallway all the way to room 31. I was out of breath when I finally entered the room. "Hello," Miss Garcia kindly greeted. "Please take a seat anywhere you'd like." Since I had entered the class so late, many of the back row seats were taken in this cluttered classroom. The front seats were mostly empty, so I took the open seat closest to the aisle. As I looked around, I noticed that this classroom was themed like an aquarium. I found that strange for whatever reason. "Welcome to your 9th grade English class, students," Miss Garcia kindly said in her thick German accent. "For our assignment today, we have an English reading on summer vacation and its effects on student education." The whole class grunted and groaned in annoyance. I rolled my eyes. Why do we have to work on the first day of school? That's dumb. Make sure to answer the questions on the back of the paper. Miss Garcia finished off as she went back to sitting behind her desk. I glanced out at my desk and noticed a cup filled with sharpened pencils and a small packet of paper, which was mounted in front of me. I flipped the paper over and realized that this was the worksheet for today. Great. In the meantime, during that boring English class, I was thinking about the fairgrounds and Mr. Franklin, and the newspaper my dad never showed me earlier. Did that have anything to do with the fairgrounds and Mr. Franklin? I wanted to know so badly that I took almost the entire period just to read the article on the paper. Didn't get close to filling out the questions on the back before the bell rang an instant. I jerked out of my seat as everybody was leaving the classroom, throwing their papers on the floor and tipping over pencil holders as they left. I got out of my seat and ran out of F Hall. I needed to check my next class, and this turned out to be a major lifesaver, PE. PE was the next class located in Gymnasium Hall. This was great because supposedly the gym classes here at the high school are incredibly fun. Even though switching classes did mess up my train of thought a little, I was still thinking about the fairgrounds and Mr. Franklin. Then something jumped into my mind in an instant. I hadn't heard from Mary Xavier in a long time. I wonder what had happened to him. He was a cool dude. Anyhow, I managed to make it to the gym just in time because the PE teacher, Mr. Austin, was already taking attendance. The inside of the gym looked nothing like what I expected it to be. There were bleachers lined up on one side of the wall, a massive gym stage that already looked like it was used this morning because several mats and yoga items were lying up there, and several basketball hoops. This gym was cool in comparison to Greenfield Middle School. "Sit down on the bleachers so I can take attendance, class," Mr. Austin shouted, silencing nearly the entire class. I sat down on the cold bleachers. These bleachers were always a pain to sit on because they were freezing. Regardless, I sat down and waited for Mr. Austin to finish attendance. 51 students in this class," Mr. Austin exclaimed as he dotted a pen down his attendance sheet. Holy smokes. Wow, 51 students. This was a massive class. I glanced up at the clock adjacent to where I was sitting. The time read 9:36, and I got here at 9:33, meaning Mr. Austin had been taking attendance for 3 minutes now. That was insane. "Psst, you there," a boy whispered to me. I jerked my head around and was now face to face with a big-looking dude. "Who are you?" I timidly asked. "Nathan," he replied. "I wanted to talk to some new people since I lost all of my friends due to the high school transition." I was surprised that others lost most of their friends because of the high school transition like me. "Do you know who I am?" I whispered in Nathan's ear. Leo? Nathan paused for a few moments before going quieter. "Leo Taurus," he said. "Are you really Leo Taurus, the one who saved the city twice?" I looked at Nathan silently. Mr. Austin was still taking attendance, yelling and calling people's names like there was no tomorrow. I began. "Actually, never mind. I'm fine with being your friend." The atmosphere filled up with this weird feeling. I glanced around the whole gym, wondering to myself, is this where Mr. Franklin went to high school? "What lunch do you have, Leo?" Nathan asked. "I think I have fifth period lunch," I said quietly. "Let me pull out my schedule to make sure." I grabbed my schedule out of my pocket. When I opened the schedule, Nathan immediately snatched it from my hands. He read the contents in a heartbeat before giving my schedule back. "We have this class, lunch, and 7th period together," Nathan sighed. "All right, class, let's head out to the soccer fields," Mr. Austin commanded. "Leave your backpack on the bleacher." Soccer field? School was already massive enough for me to think they couldn't have a soccer field, but apparently I was highly mistaken. I heard the sound of several students jumping off the bleachers, which was my cue to get off the bleachers and began following the class outside. "Wasn't it weird how Mr. Austin never called your name during attendance?" Nathan whispered. I realized that Mr. Austin called Nathan's name earlier, but never mind. Did that mean I was in the wrong class? "That is strange," I mumbled. "But really, are you Leo Taurus? Are you the Leo Taurus who saved the city?" Nathan asked again. Looked at Nathan before looking down at the ground. "Please tell me, Leo," Nathan continuously begged and insisted. "I don't want to talk about it right now," I snapped at Nathan in annoyance. "We can talk about it at lunch." Nathan took a few steps away from me. All right then, we can talk about it later then," he said. I knew this was going to be a major issue starting at a new school. People constantly asking, "Are you Leo Taurus?" I needed to come up with an undercover name, and that's when I decided to spill the beans to Nathan a few moments after I snapped at him. By this point, our class was already outside and enjoying the fresh air of the morning. I ran up to Nathan right behind his back before whispering, "Nathan, I need to tell you something." Nathan carefully moved his head back to face me. He stopped walking with the class, putting us in the back of the train of students formed by Mr. Austin's command. "What?" he annoyingly murmured. "I'm sorry for yelling at you earlier," I apologized. Nathan's eyes, which were narrowed down to slits, opened a bit wider now, revealing that he had baby blue eyes. "Will you tell me?" I cut Nathan off before he could finish speaking. "I am the real Leo Taurus. I am the person who helped save the city along with Adeline, Christopher, and Joshua," I abruptly said. Nathan's gaze felt endless after I finished speaking. Let's keep up with the class, boys, Mr. Austin yelled at us, ruining the gaze impossible train of thought Nathan had at that time. I began to speed walk up to the massive crowd of students now formed into a large circle on the massive track adjacent to the soccer field. Nathan followed close behind. The weather was clement, only with a light breeze and a few storm clouds on the horizon threatened the weather. Thought we were meeting on the soccer field, Nathan murmured. Yeah, me too, I said quietly, but I need your help with something. With what? Nathan reluctantly asked. With trying to find a good undercover name, I replied. Nathan's face was riddled with thought as his walking pace slowed to the speed of a baby's crawl. That'll be hard for you, but if you really want to make it happen, we can do it, Nathan said. Your undercover name can be David.